I hope you had a chance to read chapter 3 of the story, or the equivalent in Scripture, with the bookmarks that you have. And hopefully you've been caught up. Today, as you can see, we are talking about the life of Joseph. I don't know about you, but when I was little, I had certain things that I wanted to be. There were certain things I wanted to be when I was little, and maybe you had these too. For most people, they might want to be a professional athlete or a famous musician, or maybe a doctor or veterinarian, teacher, whatever that might be, but you probably had something in your mind that you thought you wanted to be when you grew up. For me personally, the first thing I ever wanted to do was to be a jet pilot. For some reason, I thought this would be a fun job. I have no clue why. I was about 5 years old, and for some reason I thought it'd be a lot of fun to be a pilot of a fighter jet. Now, for those of you that know me real well, you will know that I have a severe anxiety of heights, and am a little anxious about flying. I've done it, but I don't like it. So probably not the best career path for me. The second one that I wanted to be was a farmer or rancher. And this was because my great-grandpa was a rancher and had cattle and pigs and chickens and goats and just about everything you can think of. And I thought, I like animals. That'd be a fun job. I could do that. Well, that wasn't going to work out much either, because if you know me, you know I'm not really a outdoorsy type of person. I'm a more indoor type of person. And not only that, but I took ag in high school, and needless to say, I got a worse grade in ag than any other class I took in high school. So probably farmer and rancher really aren't the best job path for me. High school, I did get a little more realistic, and I thought maybe I'll be an engineer. Well, this actually made sense because my two best subjects were math and science in school. And in fact, my best subject was math, and my math teacher and everyone just thought, well, that seems like a logical career path for you to engineer. That makes a lot of sense. It makes good money. It's a good field to be in. And I even started down that path, and it was even getting recruitment letters from different colleges, and some even prestigious colleges, to come and study engineering at their school. But it didn't quite work out that way. Instead, God led me towards ministry and to a school that doesn't even have a math class, because that's the way that God sometimes works. And I remember my high school teacher, who was an elder in our church, my high school math teacher actually tried to talk me out of going to Bible school because he felt like I was wasting gifts that God gave me. And so his intentions were good, but I was following what God wanted. But I say all of this because sometimes things just don't work out the way we thought they would. Sometimes what we think we're going to do isn't what we actually do. And sometimes this is because of circumstances that we choose, and sometimes because of circumstances we don't choose. Maybe we find out that we wanted to be a musician, and you're like me and have no musical ability whatsoever, and so obviously that's not going to work out for you. Or maybe you wanted to be a professional athlete, but you ended up only being 5'2", and what you really loved was basketball, and there's never been a professional basketball player at 5'2". So you start thinking, maybe that's not what I should do. Maybe you're just not motivated, and you realize how much work it actually takes to do that, and you're just like, I don't know if I want to put that much into it. Maybe you couldn't afford the schooling, or your grades weren't quite good enough to be a doctor like you wanted to be. And so you start thinking about other career paths that maybe are more realistic. Or maybe you were thrown into a well, your death was faked, and you were sold into slavery. And that's why things didn't go quite as well as you thought they would. Now, most likely none of us probably experienced that last one, but the story today is all about someone who did. The story of Joseph. You see, we start off with the story of Joseph, and we find out that he is the favorite. He's the favorite one of his father. And this is plainly obvious because he gets a coat of many colors. And this honestly makes it known to his brothers that he is the favorite, which they probably already knew, but it makes it blatantly obvious. In fact, to put it in other terms, imagine that you have 11 children, and for Christmas one year, you get 10 of your children nice little bouncy balls. So those are nice, those are fun, but then to the 11th child, your favorite, you give an iPad. That's a problem. And all of a sudden the other children are like, whoa, 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 whoa. What's going on here? And they understood that as the favorite, Joseph wouldn't have to do as much labor as them. That's why in the story we see that he is not out in the field with his brothers. Because he doesn't have to do the same physical labor they do. He spends his time with Dad. And probably as the favorite too, it also meant that he would get his father's blessing more so than the other children. It would probably mean that he would be the main inheritor of the land and resources that his father had. And again, this promoted some jealousy with his brothers. And then Joseph, just to be honest, didn't make it any better. Because Joseph was a dreamer, and by that I mean he had dreams. And he had some dreams where he, in his dreams, would be up above his brothers, and his brothers would be bowing down to him. And what did Joseph do? Typical younger brother, he made sure he let his brothers know. Little word of advice, if you ever have a dream that your brothers are bowing down to you, it's probably best to keep that dream to yourself. Your brothers don't want to hear it. Yet, again, like I said, typical younger brother, Joseph wanted to make sure that his brothers did hear it. And so sure enough, Joseph wasn't helping things, and this jealousy kept on happening, till one day, Joseph is asked by his father, because again, he's with his father, all the rest of the brothers are out in the field, he's with his father at about age probably 17, 18, somewhere in there, and we get to him, and he goes out in the field to check on his brothers. Well, it's here that all of a sudden his brothers say, we finally have him away from Dad. Let's kill him. Let's get rid of him so we don't have to deal with this spoiled little brat anymore. Well, there was one brother who was most kind of the brothers, and he said, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery instead. That sounds like a much better option. And so what do? They throw him into a well. They take his coat of many colors. They dip it in blood to make it look like he was killed by a pack of wild animals. And they sell him to the Midianites who were traveling by, who sold or grabbed him and put him into slavery. The Midianites then turn around and they sell him to Potiphar. Now Potiphar, he was Pharaoh's captain of the guard, is what Scripture says. Well, the interpretation of this would actually be that he was his chief executor. So what Potiphar's job was he was actually the person who was in charge of carrying out the punishment that Pharaoh handed down. Now he was in charge of all of that. That is what, he was an important person, Potiphar was. And Potiphar gets Joseph and he sees something special in him. He sees that Joseph isn't like his other slaves. Joseph isn't like the other people he's been around. In fact, Joseph is a natural leader, and there's something about him that is different. And because of this, he decides to put Joseph in charge of his entire household. He puts Joseph in charge, and because of this, and because of the fact that it catches Potiphar's eye, he has a little more freedom, and he has a little more ability to do things, but he begins to catch the eye of someone else, too. He catches the eye of Potiphar's wife. And you see, the Bible is very clear that Joseph, in fact, the wording in the Bible is a well-built and handsome man. And Potiphar's wife notices that. And because of that, she wants to sleep with Joseph. She wants to sleep with Joseph because she wants him and lusts after him. But Joseph, being someone who believes in God and a godly man, does not fall for it. Now we have to understand that this passage right here, we tend to not always understand the original meaning of words and the way that the Hebrew would have read, but we often look at different things in the Bible as PG or PG-13. This was not PG or PG-13. The way that the original hearers would have heard it, this was R or even X-rated. This was very clear what Potiphar's wife wanted and what she was trying to do. And Joseph would have none of it. But that wasn't good enough for Potiphar's wife, and so she frames him. Because the sense of being rejected spurned her and embittered her towards Joseph. And she decides that if she can't have him, then he'll pay. And so Potiphar throws Joseph in prison. Now, we can read between the lines here just a little bit. And this is reading between lines, so this isn't exactly what Scripture says, but we can see something going on here. You see, Potiphar was the chief executor. And as such, he has the right to execute anyone he wants. And he could have executed Joseph. He had that authority and power to do so, but he doesn't. Instead, he throws him in jail. And it makes commentators begin to think that maybe, just maybe, he didn't really believe his wife. But he had to save face, and he couldn't just let this go on. So instead he's like, well, I don't want to kill Joseph. I like Joseph. I think he's been a good slave for me. So I'll just throw him in prison instead. So at least then it looks like I did something, but I don't actually have to take his life. And so he gets thrown in prison. Now we need to understand that this prison isn't like the prisons that we think of when we think of prison. And I know that prison, even in here, isn't necessarily a good place to be. These prisons that we have in today's culture are first world compared to what they had. A better word might be dungeon. Or even a better word might be a giant pit with bars over it that they just threw people into. To feed them, they just throw food through the grates of the bars and expect them to forage for the food themselves off the ground. And this is where Joseph finds himself. But just like when he was in Potiphar's house, the warden of the prison sees something in Joseph. There's some sort of leadership quality. There's something different about Joseph. And so the warden puts him in charge of the other prisoners. And as he's doing this, as he's in charge of these other prisoners, there's a couple prisoners that come across his way. There's the chief baker, which means that he was the baker for Pharaoh himself. And the chief cupbearer, which we can kind of think of as Pharaoh's personal attendant or Pharaoh's personal butler, might be the way we might talk about it. And these people somehow ended up in prison with Joseph. And Joseph interprets a couple of dreams that they had. These prisoners have dreams and they don't know what they mean. And so Joseph, being the kind person that he is, interprets them. And he says to them that one of you will be restored and one of you will be executed. They ask who this will be, and he says, well, the cupbearer will be restored and the baker will be executed. And sure enough, those very things happen. And Joseph just asks one little favor of the cupbearer. Just one little thing, that the cupbearer will remember him. And we talked about this before. Remembrance in the Hebrew context wasn't just something that you have in your mind, but to actually act upon. So remembering means that he wanted the person not just to say, oh, I remember Joseph, I'll think fondly upon him at another time. It meant, don't forget I'm here. Please help me get out. Help me. Well, we find out that, sure enough, Joseph asked him to remember him, but the cupbearer forgets. The cupbearer forgets and doesn't act on anything. It's here that I want to take a little break in the action. It's here that I want to take a little pause and look at where we're at with Joseph. And we see that Joseph has experienced some major disappointment in his life. Joseph had some hardships that have been very disappointing to him. Life hasn't happened exactly like he thought it would. And I think all of us here, at one time or another, have probably had some experience with disappointment ourselves. We probably had some experience with hardships and disappointment ourselves. But the important thing that I've noticed out of disappointment is that we often respond to disappointment by justifying disobedience. We often respond to disappointment by justifying disobedience. We think to ourselves, God has let us down, so I'll do what I want. I don't have to do what God wants me to do anymore. We might also think to ourselves, God hasn't been there for me, so why should I go to church? He's never been there when I needed him. Why should I be there for him when he needs me? Or maybe within like a marriage context, we might see this as a wife who doesn't feel loved by her husband. The husband doesn't show her the value that she thinks she has. And so she begins to flirt in the workplace to find the value. And sometimes that flirting leads to other things. And she's justified it, saying that I feel disappointed in my own relationship. So why should I do what I know is right? Or often we see a husband who feels like the wife makes intimacy more of a chore. And so they begin to seek intimacy elsewhere. Whether it's certain websites or in the company of other women. And before long, they're justifying it, saying, well, my wife is just a hassle to her. So I'll do what I want to. Fill in the blank wherever you want, but somehow when we're disappointed, we begin to search for something that we know is not right. And we begin to justify it, saying it's not really wrong because of this. Because of God wasn't there for me, because this person wasn't there for me, because whoever else wasn't there for me, and so therefore I am right in doing what I want to do. Now obviously, it's not right. Obviously, these are wrong things to do, but we still try to find ways to justify it. We try to find ways to justify our wrong. And this leads us to a question. Where is God? It leads us to a question. Where is God? Where is God in these hard times? Where is God in the midst of disappointment? Where is God? Where is God when we're sold into slavery and thrown into prison? No fault of our own. You see, Joseph was a slave and was a prisoner, and he had to be thinking to himself, where is this God that I believe in? Where is he? Maybe for you, you're disappointed because you've lost a job, or maybe you have bills that are just stacking up and you have no clue how you're ever going to pay the bills that are before you. Maybe you've in a bad relationship or a relationship that broke, and you're just thinking to yourself, where is God in my pain? Where is God in the disappointment that I've had? Maybe you're struggling with cancer or a loved one is. You're thinking, where is God in the face of this horrible, horrific disease? Maybe you lost a close friend or family member. And you're thinking, where is God that he allowed this person to leave me? Maybe it's not a big thing. Maybe it's just a bunch of little things that are compounding to start to weigh on your life. And you're beginning to ask this question of, where is God? We all know that life weighs us down. We know it just keeps on beating us down, and as soon as you don't think you can take any more, it gives you more. As soon as you feel like you can't handle one more thing, another thing gets put on your lap. It begins to feel like you're in a room that's closing in. The air is being sucked out. Walls are closing in. You can't breathe. And you're getting claustrophobic. And you begin to think, where is God? So we ask, where is God in these times? And where is he when it seems like we just can't take any more? When we need a little relief? When we really begin to question? Now, let me be clear here. I don't think it's wrong to question. If we read the Psalms, we see over and over again where David questions. He wonders where God is often. But David normally ends those Psalms with the same way that we see in Joseph's life. And that's in Genesis 39:2 and Genesis 39:23. It says this very clear word. The Lord was with Joseph. Now we need to understand the context of this, because in Genesis 39:2, Joseph is a slave. And in Genesis 39:23, Joseph is a prisoner in the dungeon. And yet in both of these instances, what does the Bible say? It says that the Lord was with Joseph. So where is God? God was with Joseph. And God is with us. That's where God is. Through everything, God never abandoned Joseph. It may have felt like it at times, and it may feel like it in your life, that God has abandoned you, but he has never abandoned you. If we jump back into Joseph's story here, we can see exactly how this all plays out. The last we saw Joseph, that he was forgotten by the cupbearer. And so we see him again. He's still in prison, and 2 years have gone by. 2 years he's waiting in that prison, waiting for someone to remember him, and nothing happens. And then, all of a sudden, Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, he has a couple of dreams. He has these dreams, and all of his advisors, all of his magicians, is what Scripture says, all the people that claim to be able to interpret dreams can do nothing for him. And so, all of a sudden, his cupbearer remembers. He remembers Joseph, and he acts upon it, and he tells Pharaoh, I know somebody. There's this guy I met in prison, and I had a dream, and he interpreted it correctly. Maybe he can do the same for you. And so Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And after he interprets these dreams, and tells Pharaoh that there will be 7 good years and 7 bad years, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, that Pharaoh asked Joseph, because he sees, okay, so there's something different about you. What should I do? So Joseph says, my advice is this. You find someone you trust. You find someone that is discerning and wise, and you put that person in charge of this. So Pharaoh looks at Joseph, who he just met, but he could tell there's something different about Joseph. He tells Joseph, you're my guy. You're the one that I want in charge of this. You're the one that I want to put in charge of all this. In fact, I trust you so much, I'm going to put you second in charge. Not just in charge of the production of the grain and the cattle and everything else. I want you in charge of all of Egypt. The only person you answer to is me. You answer to no one else. And sure enough, Joseph was discerning and wise, and he put back all they need to put back to where all the nations around Egypt saw that Egypt had plenty. And Egypt had not squandered their years of good, but had stored back for the years of bad, prepared. And so when famine struck, all of the nations around Egypt were struck by it as well. And then some other lands, such as Canaan, which if you know Canaan, you know where that's at. You know who eventually settles there, and that's the Israelites. And who was settling there at this time but the family of Joseph. And they're hit by famine as well. And they didn't store anything back. So all of a sudden they have no food. And they're beginning to wonder, what should we do? And so Joseph's father sends his brothers in search of grain. They get to Egypt and they don't recognize Joseph. And why should they? Why would they ever expect the person they never thought they'd see again to be second in charge of all of Egypt? And that's where Joseph is. And through some different circumstances and some trials and some tests that Joseph gives them, they are reunited as a family. And because they're reunited, the whole family comes to Egypt. And because of this, they survive the famine. So where was God? God was with Joseph. You see, God was with Joseph the whole way. Now, you understand that Joseph had to spend 13 years as either a slave or a prisoner before there started to be some good things happening to him. But God was with him nonetheless. You see, we see the lower story here. We see this lower story that his life is hard and it's full of disappointment. That's a lower story. That's Joseph's story and that's our story. Life is hard and it's full of disappointment. It's not easy. There will be trying times, but then we get to the upper story. And the upper story is that God has a bigger plan in the midst of hardship and disappointment. God has a bigger plan in the midst of hardship and disappointment. I often think of it like this. I don't know if you remember those mosaic posters that had built into one big poster. They had one image. I remember my brother had one of Yoda from Star Wars on his wall. But this picture of Yoda was made from little tiny film clips from the Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy, that built in to make Yoda. Now, when you were 20 feet off, all you could see was Yoda. But when you were right there in the midst of the poster, all you could see was a few of those little pictures. We're in the midst of the poster. And all we can see are these few little pictures, these few little stories that make up the people's lives around us, and we can't see the big picture of what's making. But God sees a big picture. He has a bigger plan in the midst of hardship and disappointment. You see, it's important to note that God didn't cause the hardships and disappointments. He didn't make them happen, but in His sovereignty, He can make them work. He can make them work and accomplish the bigger things that He has planned. He didn't cause Joseph to be sold into slavery. He didn't cause Joseph to be thrown into prison. But what He was able to do was, when Joseph was sold into slavery and was put in prison, He can work with that. God can work with that. I fully believe that if Joseph wouldn't have been sold into slavery or wouldn't have been put in prison, somehow Joseph would have ended up second in command in Egypt. I don't know how, because I'm not God. I don't see the bigger picture. But I truly believe that in His sovereignty, He could make that happen. But what He did was He took the hardships of Joseph's life and put them in the exact position He needed to be to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh and being put in second charge. In fact, the Bible makes it clear that this is how God works. If we look at Romans 8:28, we see a passage that is very clear on how God works when it comes to these hardships. Romans 8:28, it says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. Now, I think it's important to note that that doesn't mean that God causes good things to happen to you. That's not what it says. It doesn't say that if you love God, He will make only good things happen to you. It says He works for the good of those who love Him. You see, He'll take any bad moment that you have in your life and He'll use them for good, according to His purpose. So any disappointment that you have in your life, any hardship that you have in your life, if you allow God to use them, He can make them good. And just like He did in Joseph's life. God was able to take Joseph's hardships and save Joseph's family. God was able to use Joseph's hardships and had a bigger purpose in mind for them. And through this, the nation of Israel was saved from famine. The nation of Israel was saved from starvation. You see, Joseph's smaller stories, his lower stories, were feeding into God's bigger story. God's upper story. Joseph couldn't see it, but God did. God always sees the big picture. So the question is, what is our takeaway from this? What is the thing that we leave here today knowing? And that is, never give up on God's ability to redeem your story. Never give up on God's ability to redeem your story. God can redeem anything. He can redeem anything that is happening in your life. You see, sometimes we get so bogged down by what's happening here and now that we don't see the bigger things that are happening around us, and we just can't understand how God could use them. But don't give up, because God can use anything. You see, sometimes we just need to remind ourselves that hardships and disappointments are opportunities for God to show His redemptive power. Yes, they are hard, and yes, it's disappointing in life, but those are just opportunities for God to show His strength and His power in the way that He redeems things. Again, I want to note that God does not cause the hardships and disappointments, but He does redeem them. He turns them around, and what Satan intended for bad, God uses for good. And that's the way He works. God can use anything or anyone. Nothing is ever too far gone, too far lost or too broken for God to use. It doesn't matter if you just lost your job. It doesn't matter if you just got diagnosed with cancer. God can use all of those things for good. That doesn't mean that they won't be disappointing or they won't be hard. But it means that if we allow him to, he can redeem them. Joseph went through a lot in his life. But God used it. God used it to redeem the story of Joseph and save the nation of Israel. Through it all, Joseph never gave up on God. And we know that very clearly because whenever God helped Joseph interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, Joseph didn't take credit. He's immediately taken out of prison, interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, and he could have easily said, yes, I'm amazing. That's not what he did. He said, God has graced me to be able to do this. God has given me the power to do this. It's not by my own power, but by God's power that this happens. He gave full credit to God. And in fact, when we look at Genesis 50:20, and we see Joseph at the end of his life, and we see Joseph talking to his brothers, and his brothers are still scared that now that their father is dead, that maybe Joseph might try to pay them back for what they did to him. And so Joseph assures them of this in verse 20 of chapter 50. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. See, Joseph understood that God could redeem anything. And he can redeem his story just like he can redeem our story. And this right here, in this redemption, is where the upper story and the lower story intersects. In this redemption process is where our story and God's story meet. And it's a powerful thing. And when we allow God to redeem our story, it intersects with God's story. And through that, people will see something a little bit different. Just like people saw something a little bit different in Joseph. That's what the difference was. It was that Joseph never gave up on God's redeeming power. He always trusted God to work for his good. Let us pray.